I'd like to add my welcome to that which you already had to everyone who has joined this virtual meeting. It deals with crucial issues because, make no mistake, COVID-19 should not have struck us so unawares. Why were even rich countries so unprepared? It's because politicians and the public have a local focus and downplay the long-term and the global. They ignore Nate Silver's maxim, the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. Indeed, we're in denial about a whole raft of emergent threats to our interconnected world, which could be devastating. They're the theme of this conference. Some, like climate change and environmental degradation, are caused by humanity's ever heavier collective footprint. We know them well, but fail to prioritize countermeasures because their worst impact stretches beyond the time horizon of political and investment decisions. It's like the proverbial boiling frog, contented in a warming tank until it's too late to save itself. Another class of threat, global pandemics and massive cyber attacks, for instance, are immediately destructive and could happen at any time. The worst of them could be so devastating that one occurrence is too many, and their probability and potential severity is increasing. And some natural events, earthquakes, volcanoes, and solar flares, have an unchanging annual probability, unaffected by humans. But their economic and human costs get greater as populations grow and global infrastructures become more vulnerable. COVID-19 is a wake-up call. It reminds us of the urgency of the issues this conference addresses, and that we'll have a bumpy ride through this century. I'll start, however, with a flashback. The most extreme threat for my generation, when we were young, was nuclear annihilation. Kennedy put the probability of war over Cuba in 1962 as between 1 in 3 and evens. His defense secretary, McNamara, when older and wiser, said, "We were lucky." And we all learned later of various false alarms and other lucky escapes during the 1970s and 80s. Many would assert that nuclear deterrence worked. In a sense it did, but that doesn't mean it was a wise policy. If you play Russian roulette with 1 or 2 bullets in the cylinder, you're more likely to survive than not. But the stakes would need to be extremely high, or the value you place on your life inordinately low, for this to be a wise gamble. But we were dragooned into just such a gamble throughout the Cold War era. For my part, I wouldn't have chosen to risk a 1 in 3 or even a 1 in 6 chance of a catastrophe that would have killed hundreds of millions and shattered the historic fabric of all our cities, even if the alternative were certain Soviet dominance of Western Europe. And of course, the devastating consequence of thermonuclear war would have spread far beyond the countries that faced a direct threat, especially if nuclear winter were triggered. Nuclear war still looms over us. The only consolation is that there are about 5 times fewer weapons and a lower alert than the US and Russia deployed during the Cold War. But there are now 9 nuclear powers and a higher chance than ever before that smaller nuclear arsenals might be used regionally or even by terrorists. And work done at CSER shows that command and control systems are getting more vulnerable to cyber threats. Moreover, we can't rule out later this century a standoff between new superpowers that could be handled less well or less luckily than the Cuba crisis was. Nuclear weapons are 20th century technology, but this century has brought surges in new technologies, bio, cyber, and AI, whose implications this meeting will focus on. And the backdrop to all our present concerns is a world where humanity's collective footprint is getting heavier. There are twice as many of us as there were in the 1960s, about 7.8 billion, all more demanding of energy and resources. But the number of births per year worldwide peaked a few years ago and is going down in most countries. Nonetheless, world population is forecast to rise to about 9 billion by 2050. That rise is partly because most people in the developing world are young, they're yet to have children, and they live longer, and partly because the demographic transition hasn't happened in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa. Despite doom-laden forecasts by the Club of Rome and Paul Ehrlich, food production has kept pace with rising population. Famines still occur, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not overall scarcity. To feed 9 billion in 2050 will require further improved agriculture, intensive, low-till, water-conserving and GM crops, and maybe dietary innovations, converting insects, highly nutritious and rich in protein, into palatable food and making artificial meat. To quote Gandhi, there'll be enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Population projections beyond 2050 are uncertain. It's not clear whether there'll be a global rise or fall. But if, for whatever reason, families in Africa remain large, then according to the UN, that continent's population could double again by 2100 to 4 billion, thereby raising global population to 11 billion. Optimists say that each extra mouth brings 2 hands and a brain. But it's the geopolitical stresses, the inequalities between countries as well as within countries, that are most worrying. As compared to the fatalism of earlier generations, those in poor countries now know, via the internet, etc., what they're missing. They are embittered by their unjust fate, and emigration is easier. It's a portent for disaffection and instability. We'll hear later from a distinguished expert, Malcolm Potts. Wealthy nations, especially those in Europe, should urgently promote growing prosperity in Africa and do this not just for altruistic reasons. And another thing, if humanity's collective imprint on land use and climate pushes too hard, the resultant ecological shock could irreversibly impoverish our biosphere. Extinction rates are rising. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it. Biodiversity is crucial to human well-being, but preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above what it means to us humans. To quote the great Harvard ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. And Partha Dasgupta, CSIR's chairman, is currently preparing a report on the economics of biodiversity for the US government, which hopefully will be as influential as the Stern report on climate. So the world's getting more crowded, and as another firm prediction, it'll gradually get warmer. In contrast to population issues, climate change is certainly not under-discussed, though it is still sadly under-responded to. The 5th IPCC report presented a spread of projections for different assumptions about future rates of fossil fuel use and associated rises in CO2 concentration. And the need for urgent action was highlighted in its update published in 2018. Under business as usual scenarios, we can't rule out later in this century really catastrophic warming and tipping points triggering long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's ice cap. But even those who accept this differ in how urgently they advocate action today. The divergences in view stem from differences in economics and ethics, in particular in how much obligation we should feel towards future generations, whether we discount long-term concerns or feel we should pay an insurance premium to reduce the risk to future generations. But to insert a bit of good cheer, there's one win-win roadmap to a low-carbon future. Nations should accelerate R&D into all forms of low-carbon energy generation and into other technologies where parallel progress is crucial, especially storage, batteries, compressed air, pumped storage, hydrogen, etc., and smart grids. The faster these clean technologies advance, the sooner their prices will fall, so they become affordable to, for instance, India, where more generator capacity is needed, and where the health of the poor is now jeopardized by smoky stoves burning wood and dung, and where there would otherwise be pressure to build coal-fired power stations. It's good that Cambridge Zero is a flagship university project to promote this goal, and it would be hard to think of any aspiration for young engineers better than trying to provide clean and affordable energy for the entire world. We should be evangelists for new technology, not Luddites. Without it, the world can't provide sustainable energy, nor nourishing food and good health for an expanding population. But many of us are anxious that it's advancing so fast that we may not properly cope with it, and the technology's misuse can give us a bumpy ride this century. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics offer prospects of containing natural pandemics. But the same research raises what's my number one worry, the prospect of engineered pandemics. For instance, in 2012, groups in Wisconsin and in Holland showed it was surprisingly easy to make the influenza virus both more virulent and more transmissible. To some, this was a scary portent of things to come. Such gain of function experiments can be done in principle for coronaviruses too. And the new CRISPR-Cas9 technique for gene editing is hugely promising, but raises ethical concerns and worries about possible runaway consequences of gene drive programs which wipe out species as diverse as mosquitoes or grey squirrels. Regulation of biotech is needed, but I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that's a nightmare. Whereas an atomic bomb can't be built without large-scale special purpose facilities that are easily monitored, biotech involves small-scale dual-use equipment. And the global village will have its village idiots, and their idiocies can now cascade globally. The rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups, or even individuals, by biotech and by cybertech as well, will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between freedom and privacy and security. These concerns are relatively near term, within the next 10 or 15 years. What about 2050 and beyond? On the bio front, we might expect two things. First, a better understanding of the combination of genes which determine key human characteristics. And second, the ability to synthesize genomes that match these features. If it becomes possible for biohackers to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, then our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. And what about another transformative technology, robotics and AI? DeepMind's AlphaGo Zero computer famously beat human champions in the games of Go and chess. It was given just the rules and trained itself by playing against itself over and over again for just a few hours. Already, AI can cope better than humans with complex, fast-changing networks, traffic flows, or electric grids. And the Chinese have enough data and processing power to have an efficient, planned economy that Marx could only dream of. And it can help science too. Protein folding, drug development, and perhaps even settle whether string theory can really describe our universe. And the societal applications of AI are already ambivalent. The incipient shift in the nature of work have been addressed in several excellent books by economists and social scientists. We need a system that taxes the robot owners to create jobs for carers, for young and old, teaching assistants, etc., to replace jobs in Amazon warehouses and call centers. AI systems will become more intrusive and pervasive. Records of all our movements, our health and our financial transactions will be in the cloud, managed by some multinational quasi-monopoly. If we're sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for a surgery, or even given a poor credit rating, we would expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. If such decisions were delegated to algorithms, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if presented with compelling evidence that on average, the machines make better decisions than the humans they've usurped. The arms race between cyber criminals and those trying to defend against them will become still more expensive and vexatious. So many think that AI, like synthetic biotech, already needs guidelines for responsible innovation. And CCCR and its sister institutions have produced some important reports. Ethical tensions are already emerging when AI moves from the research phase to being a potentially massive money spinner for global companies. It's of course the speed of computers which allows them to learn on big training sets. But as Stuart Russell has emphasized, learning about human behavior, acquiring common sense, won't be so easy for them. It involves observing actual human beings in real homes and workplaces. And the machine will be sensorily deprived by the slowness of real life. It's like watching trees grow is for us. And robots are still clumsier than a child in moving pieces on a real chessboard. They can't jump from tree to tree like a squirrel, but sensor technology is advancing fast. But we don't know how fast. And this leads to a digression. It's always harder to forecast the speed of technological advances than their direction. Sometimes it's a spell of exponential progress, like the spread of IT and smartphones in the last decade. But in the longer term, it's more like a sigmoid curve. Two examples. From Alcock and Brown's first transatlantic flights in 1919 to the first jumbo jet was 50 years. But 50 years later, we still have the jumbo jet. And it was only 12 years from Sputnik 1 to the moon landings. But 50 years later, the moon landings are still the high point of human spaceflight. So experts are getting less optimistic about how quickly we'll have some innovations, for instance, stage 5 fully driverless cars. And the iPhone 24 may not be too different from the iPhone 12. But let's look still further ahead. What if a machine developed a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or go rogue? Futuristic books by Nick Bostrom and Max Tegmark portray a dark side, where AI gets out of its box, infiltrates the Internet of Things, and pursues goals misaligned with human interests, or even treats humans as an encumbrance. Some AI pundits take this seriously and think the field already needs guidelines, just as biotech does. But others, like Rodney Brooks, inventor of the Baxter robot, regard these concerns as premature and think it will be a long time before artificial intelligence will worry us more than real stupidity. But be it as it may, it's likely that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether they'll be idiot savants or display superhuman capabilities, and whether we should therefore worry more about breakdowns and bugs or about being outsmarted. The futurologist Ray Kurzweil, now working at Google, argues that once machines have surpassed human capabilities, they could themselves design and assemble a new generation of even more powerful ones, an intelligence explosion, the singularity. He wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines, where he predicted that humans would transcend biology by merging with computers. in old style spiritualist parlance, they'd go over to the other side. We then confront the classic philosophical problem of personal identity. Could your brain be downloaded into a machine? If so, in what sense would it still be you? Should you be relaxed about your original body then being destroyed? What would happen if several clones of you were made? These are ancient conundrums for philosophers, but practical ethicists may one day be moved to address them. But Kurzweil is worried that his nirvana won't happen in his lifetime. So he wants his body frozen until that time's reached. A company in Arizona will store your body in liquid nitrogen so that when immortality is on offer, you can be resurrected and your brain downloaded. And two of our distinguished Oxford colleagues have gone in for this cryonics. I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard than an American refrigerator. But of course, biomedical research on aging is being seriously prioritized. Will the benefits be incremental, or is aging a disease that can be cured? Dramatic life extension would plainly be a real wild card in population projections with huge social ramifications. But it may happen along with human enhancement in other forms. Indeed, it's at least on the cards that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may become malleable through the deployment of genetic modification and cyborg techniques. Moreover, this future evolution, a kind of secular intelligent design, would take only centuries, thousands of times faster than Darwinian evolution. This is a game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a time gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their civilizations. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have an algorithmic understanding of how we behave. And this, incidentally, is one issue where I quibble with Tony Ord's excellent book. Because of these rapid changes, it doesn't seem realistic to have a centuries-long conclave to formulate plans stretching for hundreds of millennia. Back now to the nearer term. The historical record reveals episodes where civilizations have crumbled and even been extinguished. This was done famously by Jared Diamond, and Luke Kemp and others here are cataloging more such events. But the difference now is that our world's so interconnected that a catastrophe couldn't hit any region without its consequences cascading globally. And by the way, pandemics not only spread fast and spread globally, as they didn't in the past, they caused far worse societal breakdown. European villages in the 14th century continued to function, even when the Black Death halved their populations. In contrast, our societies would be vulnerable to serious unrest as soon as hospitals were overwhelmed, which would occur before the fatality rate was even 1%. And there's likewise huge societal risk and even reversion to anarchy from cyber attacks on infrastructure. What if the electricity grid or the internet failed this month, for instance? That's why we need to contemplate a collapse, societal or ecological. It would be a truly global setback. The setback could be temporary. On the other hand, it could cascade and spread so devastatingly and entail so much environmental or genetic degradation that the survivors would never regenerate a civilization at the present level. But this prompts the question, could there be a separate class of extreme events that would be curtains for us all, fully existential catastrophes that could snuff out all humanity? This has been discussed in the context of biological or high energy physics experiments, which create conditions that have never occurred naturally. Can scientists credibly give assurances that their experiments will be safe? We can offer huge odds against the sun not rising tomorrow, or against a fair die giving 100 sixes in a row, because we're confident we understand these things. But if our understanding is shaky, as it plainly is on the scientific frontiers, we can't really assign a probability. So biologists should avoid creation of potentially devastating genetically modified pathogens or large-scale modifications of the human germline. Cyber experts are aware of the risk of a cascading breakdown in global infrastructure, and innovators who are furthering the beneficial use of advanced AI, they should avoid scenarios where the machine might take over. Many of us are inclined to dismiss these risks as science fiction, but given the stakes, they should not be ignored, even if deemed really highly improbable. On the other hand, innovations have an upside too. Application of the precautionary principle has an opportunity cost, the hidden cost of saying no. We should be mindful of that as well. And by the way, the priority that we should accord to avoiding these highly unlikely, truly existential disasters depends on an ethical question that's been discussed by the philosopher Derek Parfit, the rights of those who aren't yet born. Consider two scenarios. Scenario A wipes out 90% of humanities. Scenario B wipes out 100%. How much worse is B than A? Some would say 10% worse. The body count's 10% higher. But Parfit argued that it might be incomparably worse because human extinction forecloses the existence of billions, even trillions of future people, and indeed of an open-ended post-human future, spreading far beyond the Earth. Some philosophers criticize Parfit's argument, denying that possible people should be weighted as much as actual ones. They'd say we want to make more people happy, not to make more happy people. And even if we take these naive utilitarian arguments seriously, one should note that if aliens already existed, terrestrial expansion by squeezing their habitats might make a net negative contribution to overall cosmic contentment. However, aside from these intellectual games about possible people, the prospect of an end to the human story would sadden those of us now living. Most of us, aware of the heritage we've been left by past generations, would be depressed if we believed that there would not be many generations to come. But I think it's worth considering such extreme scenarios as a thought experiment, because we can't rule out human-induced threats far worse than those on our current risk register. Indeed, we have zero grounds for confidence that we can survive the worst that future technology could bring. These issues are a mega version of the issues that arise in climate policy, where it's controversial how much weight we should give to those who will live centuries hence. It also influences our attitude to global population trends. But I'd like to conclude by reverting to nearer term concerns. Opinion polls show, unsurprisingly, that younger people who expect to survive most of the century are more engaged and anxious about long-term global issues. Their campaigning is welcome. Their commitment gives grounds for hope. What should be our message to them? It's surely that there's no scientific impediment to achieving a sustainable world where all enjoy a lifestyle better than we in the West do today. We live under the shadow of new risks, but these can be minimized by a culture of responsible innovation, especially in fields like biotech, advanced AI, and geoengineering, and by reprioritizing the thrust of the world's technological effort. So we can be technological optimists, but the intractable politics of sociology does engender pessimism. The scenarios I've described, environmental degradation, unchecked climate change, unintended consequences of advanced technology, could trigger serious, even catastrophic setbacks to our society. And of course, most of the challenges are global. Coping with COVID-19 is plainly a global challenge. And the threats of potential shortage of food, water, and natural resources, and transitioning to low carbon energy can't be solved by each nation separately, nor can the regulation of potentially threatening innovations, especially those spearheaded by globe-spanning commercial conglomerates. Indeed, a key issue is whether, in a new world order, nations need to give up more sovereignty to new organizations along the lines of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, etc. Scientists have an obligation to promote beneficial applications of their work and to warn against the downsides. Universities should use their staff's expertise and their convening power to assess which scary scenarios, echo threats or risk from misapplied technologies can be dismissed as science fiction and how best to avoid the serious ones. Politicians focus on immediate threats like COVID-19, but they won't prioritize the global and long-term measures needed to deal with climate change and biodiversity unless the press and their inboxes keep these high on their agenda. Science advisors to government have limited influence except in emergencies, but they can enhance their leverage by involvement with NGOs, by blogging and journalism, and by enlisting charismatic individuals and the media to amplify their voice. Politicians will make wise decisions, but only if they feel they won't lose votes thereby. And to give an example, Michael Gove, not a especially enlightened minister, when he was Minister for the Environment, introduced legislation against non-renewable drinking straws. He knew that the public cared about that, and the public cared because millions had watched David Attenborough's program Blue Planet 2, which showed albatrosses returning to their nests and coughing up for their young, not the longed-for nourishment, but bits of plastic. That's an iconic image for ocean purification, just as the polar bear on the melting ice floe has been for climate science. Well, I'll end with another flashback, not just the 1960s, but right back to the Middle Ages. For medieval people, the entire cosmology, from creation to apocalypse, spanned only a few thousand years. They were bewildered and helpless in the face of floods and pestilences, and prone to irrational dread. Most of the earth was terra incognita to them. But they built cathedrals, constructed with primitive technology by masons who knew they wouldn't live to see them finished. These vast and glorious buildings still inspire us centuries later. Our horizons in space and time are now vastly extended, as are our resources and knowledge. But we don't plan centuries ahead. At first sight, it seems a paradox, but there is a reason. Medieval lives played out against a backdrop that changed little from one generation to the next. So they were confident that they'd have grandchildren who would appreciate the finished cathedral. But for us, unlike for them, the next century will be drastically different from the present. We can't foresee it, so it's harder to plan for it. And there's now a huge disjunction between the ever-shortening timescale of social and technical change and the billion-year time spans of biology, geology, and cosmology. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support systems vulnerable to disruption and breakdown. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning. We need to think globally. We need to think rationally. We need to think long-term, empowered by 21st century technology, but guided by values that science alone can't provide. And that is the motive, I suspect, for many of us attending this meeting and the discussions. Thank you very much for listening.